How old does a person have to be before their vows become binding? Now, you'd think it's bar bas mitzvah. It's not as simple as that. And we're going to analyze in quite a lot of depth the various options of a person who is not yet a full-blown adult having the capacity to make a neder, and what kind of tests and how long those tests have to last to verify if their neder, if their vow is binding. In Hilchos Nedarim, bringt the Rambam from Mishnah, den Din benegerts Nidrei Cotton. In Hilchos Nedarim, the Rambam quotes the Mishnah in Masechta Nidr that talks about a child who is underage making a neder, and he writes as follows. A child who is 12 years old and a day, in other words, into their 13th year. Or a girl who is the equivalent 11 years old and a day, and they made either an oath or a vow, we have to check them. That means we ask them, do they understand the context? Who was this neder dedicated to? Do they have the maturity to appreciate the impact of the neder? If yes, then nidrein kayamin, their vows are binding. But if they don't understand the context, they don't appreciate the gravitas of taking an oath, then their words are meaningless, their vows are meaningless. So we have to check them, right? When do we check them? Says the Rambam. We have to check them consistently throughout that whole year, which means the whole 12th year until her bas mitzvah for a girl, the whole 13th year until his bar mitzvah for a boy. Das heißt, in other words, in other words, in a girl, we're checking from her 11th birthday until her 12th birthday. And in the case of the boy, we're checking him consistently from when he turns 12 until he turns 13. And in the halacha then the Rambam continues in the next halacha. Keitzad, what does that mean practically? And this is the part that we're going to zone in on. Let's say that they made a vow at the beginning of that year. And at that time we consulted, we asked them, and we realized that they understand the context of what a neder is and who it's directed at. Then iskayim nidron. And then because they understood, we were able to ratify their vow and declare that it's binding. And then later on, they then made another neder even much later at the end of that same year. We have to check them again. And only if again they can prove to us that they understand the value of a neder, then the neder is binding. The Rambam's clear. We don't say, we don't say, well, look, at the beginning of the year, they knew what Nedarim was all about, so now we don't have to check them again. You have to check their maturity throughout that entire year, from 11 to 12 for a girl, from 12 to 13 for a boy. Fragt der Kesef Mishnah, so the Kesef Mishnah says, where does the Rambam get this from? Where did the Rambam get that that's how it works, that if you check them at the beginning of the year, you still have to check later on in the year? The Gemara, even if at the beginning of the year they knew what they were swearing about. Because the Gemara says, Boyd can call you base. You have to check throughout that whole 12th year. Why? Because that if we check them for the first 30 days, and in many halachic respects, 30 days of a year is already considered a year. So if we check them in the first 30 days of the year, or throughout the first 30 days of the year, and the girl, because we're talking about the 12th year, in other words, from 11 to 12, did not know how to clarify what the purpose of a neder is, you'd think, okay, that's it. So she's obviously not somebody we can rely upon until her bas mitzvah. Don't check her again. No, you have to check her again. In other words, a mashma, the Kesef Mishnah is understanding from the Gemara, the time of Mishum, the loy yoder lahaflois. Sounds like the Mishnah is saying, or the Gemara is commenting on the Mishnah, that the reason you have to check again throughout the course of the year is because at the beginning of the year she illustrated that she doesn't really understand what a neder is all about. And the implication thereof is, surely that implies that if at the beginning of the year she did appreciate the severity of a vow, then you would not have to check her again. And the Rambam says you would consistently throughout the year. Where did he get that from? Does not seem to be what the Gemara is saying. And there's Messiah, and the Kesef Mishnah concludes, so the Kesef Mishnah says, maybe the Rambam had a different girsa of the Gemara. Our Gemara says, we checked the girl at the beginning of the year, and she did not appreciate the value of the neder And the Chiddush is you can still check her again later in the year. Possibly the Rambam had a different version that said, we checked her at the beginning of the year, and she did know what the meaning of an oath was, and we still are making her, we're still checking her throughout the course of the year. So you would have thought if at the beginning of the year you could establish maturity, you would not have to check her again later in the year. Kamash Malon, and that's what the Gemara was coming to teach us in the potential version that maybe the Rambam had, that you'd still have to check the girl consistently through the year, and the same would apply to a boy, even if they had already been established to know the idea of a vow. The Radva says something similar. And here the Likewise, the Radva says maybe the Rambam had a different girsa of the Gemara. And he goes further to say, the truth is that if there is another girsa of the Gemara, it actually makes more sense. Why? So we could ask a simple question on the Gemara as we have it in the most common version, which is, if a child does not know how to appreciate the severity of a vow at the beginning of the year, can they not grow up and mature later in the year and understand and come to appreciate the value of a vow? What would be the big surprise that the Gemara has to tell us, or the Mishnah had to tell us, that you keep checking them through the course of the year? Whereas, if we're going with this supposed alternate girsa that the Radvaz and the Kesef Mishnah are suggesting that the Rambam had, which is that at the beginning of the year, she did know, or he did know the value of the vow, and we still have to check again, then we could appreciate what the Mishnah is telling us. But if somebody did not know the beginning of the year, obviously you keep testing until you see if maybe they grew up. So what's much more impressive or surprising or interesting to us is that at the beginning of the year, the child exhibited maturity and understood what a vow is, and still we don't establish a chazaka based on that, and we check them again. That would be interesting information to us, that you've got to keep checking the knowledge and awareness the child has. Okay, simple answer. It would appear the Rambam was using a different girsa of the Gemara. Problem is, we have another source of the Rambam where clearly he had the same girsa of the Gemara as us. Where is that? The Pirush HaMishnah is on that Mishnah in Nida. Shait the Rambam beferish. The Rambam says clearly, Nivdakim kol yud beis, you check the girl throughout the whole of her 12th year, and the same for a boy in his 13th year. You would have thought, had we asked them for the first 30 days and discovered that they don't know the value of a vow, then you would have thought, you would have thought, that's it, now you don't check them again. So the Mishnah had to tell us, no, you're going to give them another chance later on. In other words, which means that the Rambam did have the same girsa as we do, which is that the Mishnah and therefore the Gemara are saying that at the beginning of the year the child does not necessarily have the maturity necessary to make a vow, and we keep checking them later in the year, which raises the question, how come then in the Yad HaChazaka does the Rambam say, and even if the child did know the value of a vow, you still have to check them throughout the course of the year? Where did that come from? In Meiri state, the Meiri tells us, the Meiri says, well, the truth of the matter is it would work either way. And what he's saying is, if we check them at the beginning of the year, we'd still have to check through the rest of the year. Let's say at the beginning of the year, they did not have the maturity to appreciate how important a vow is, or keeping a vow is. And then later on, they took another vow. We're not going to say, listen, we checked them 3 months ago, and they had no idea what a vow is, so therefore they don't know. Maybe during the 3 months, they learnt what vows are all about, and they have matured their perspective about a vow. And the truth is, the exact same law would apply in reverse. Even at the beginning of the year, they knew the value of a vow. And based on that, we established their vow as binding. Later on, they make another vow. We're not going to give them an automatic acceptance of the value of their vow. We're going to check them again. In other words, what's the Meiri saying? It works both ways. As the Rambam learned, as Choshik Yus in Gemara is Kilofonenu, Salkatay Tchamina, Hechet de Bodakno, Lamed, Velo Yod Elavlois. Maybe the Rambam's doing a similar thing to the Meiri, which is, yes, the example used in our Mishnah is a child who didn't know the value of a vow, and therefore has to be tested again and again and again throughout the year to see if they grew up or they came to appreciate. But even though that's the example the Mishnah used, the Rambam perhaps agrees with the Meiri that the same halacha applies, even if they did know at the beginning of the year what the value of the vow is. That even if they knew the value of a vow, and based on that we establish their vow as binding, and later on they make another vow, we will not establish their vow until we have checked again that they have the same awareness. Maybe that's the answer. And also the Rambam uses the exact opposite example of the Mishnah and only that example. Friend, we could say, well, that's really simple because the Rambam typically is very succinct to try and load us with as much information as possible in as few words as possible. Maybe the reason the Rambam chose the example where the child understood the value of a vow earlier on in the year, and we still have to check them, because that's actually more surprising information for us. And the Rambam, by telling us that, would say, certainly then in a case where they did not know at the beginning of the year what a vow is, we'd have to check them through the course of the year to see if perhaps they've now come to appreciate it. The only problem is, the answer doesn't, it's a great answer, except it doesn't answer a very important point, which is, whichever way you look at this, doesn't seem to make sense. If the Rambam quoted that example because that's the more surprising example, why didn't the Gemara do the same thing? Tell me the example of a child who understood a neder and we're still going to check them later because that's what you hadn't anticipated. Surely the Gemara would want to do that too. Therefore, was the Gemara sagt nicht der Chiddush is moving Kanal from Kesef Mishnah. The fact that the Gemara did not use the example specifically of a child who knew the value of a vow and still has to be checked, that implies, like the Kesef Mishnah said, that would seem to imply, like the Kesef Mishnah extrapolated out of the Gemara, that if the child does actually understand the value of a vow, we don't have to check them again through the course of the year, and then we're back to square one. So why did the Rambam say that you do? And the implication of the Kesef Mishnah, and it would seem to be the implication of the Gemara also, is that if the child shows that they understand the value of a vow, they should now have a chazaka upon which we can trust them going forward, that any time they make a vow, it should be binding. Why didn't the Rambam say that? Now, in recent years, the Rebbe points out that they published the more recent or the latter version of the Rambam's Pirush HaMishnayos. So there the Rambam says that you would have thought that if they were asked about if they understand what a vow is, you would have thought if in the beginning of the year you interview them and they understand what a neder is, that's it. We don't have to check them any further. Meaning that there is a later version of the Rambam's Pirush HaMishnayos where he changes to say that he does believe that the girsa in the Gemara is, when do you have to check a youngster if they've made a neder, even after they've proven that they know what the neder is, which aligns with what the Rambam wrote in Mishnah Torah, Mishnah, and that fits with the two commentaries offered by the Kesef Mishnah and Radbaz, which is the Gemara had another girsa. Okay, great. And even if we go with that, the question is, why was there a Mahadura Kama in the first place? In other words, the fact that there was an original version of Pirush HaMishnayos, where the Rambam used the most common version of the Gemara, that you test a child throughout the course of the year if the first time we tested them about a vow, they didn't appreciate what it was. Und die Mahadura from Pirush HaMishnayos is in Spasim Givorim B'chol Tfutzi Sob B'Meshech Kol HaDoros, and let's remember that up until very recently, that was the accepted version of what the Rambam had to say. That implies that the Rambam certainly believed that approach, that the reason you check whether or not the child understands the power of a vow is because earlier in that year they did not. That seems to be something the Rambam took very seriously. And the Rambam might very well then adopt the opinion of the other commentaries, which is, if earlier on in the year the child could illustrate that they understood the power of a vow, no reason to ask them any further. So darf man gefunden, als Borah Favos hat der Rambam Charote gehabt, und angenommen darf die Girse built in a foot for Yodel Haflois, you have to ask yourself, why did the Rambam then, later, when he revised the Pirush HaMishnayos with the Madura Basra, why did he move away from the most common version of the Gemara? And why did he move to specifically now use Yodel Haflois, that even when the child knew what the vow is about, we're still going to check them throughout the course of that year? The Wunder is noch größer, what makes this even more surprising is, that Girsas Rambam Madura Basra B'Yodel Haflois v'toiskum lachidesh nifla. When you go with the Rambam's perspective, now quoted in the more recent version, the revised version of the Pirush HaMishnayos, it raises a massive question generally in halacha, which is, in every other area of Jewish law, we take a chazaka as binding. If somebody has established credentials, we rely on those credentials. It's by Nedorim anders. But for some reason, when it comes to Nedorim, we don't rely on credentials. And then, even if we have tested the child, given them now credibility that they understand what a vow is all about, now we're going to test him again later in the year in case something changed. When do we ever take an halachic approach that says maybe the chazaka changed? Not only that, noch mehr from the Sheina Rambam is Gor Mashma, the fact that the Rambam says first you test them and only then is their vow binding, that implies as bizmis moed beide katzveitenmol is another klal kenedenit. Not only are we double checking that the neder is still in place, we're saying there is no neder until we check. That's a subtle but significant difference. I feel it be suffix. It's not even that maybe the neder is kaim. Obviously, it's noch mehr meferish in the Shein Atur eine neder ad shiv to come pam acheres. The Torah says it clearly. It is not a neder until tested again by the authorities. That's weird. But we've already established that this is a child with maturity who appreciates the value of a neder. Now we're saying, but their neder is not a neder until it's checked again. We have to find a compelling reason why the Rambam completely revised his view from the original version of the Pirush HaMishnayos. And now trying to understand why the Rambam adopted the lesser known Girsa in the Gemara and a radical opinion that a chazaka does not apply in the case of Nedarim. I feel it al suffix, not even that perhaps the Nedarim should be taken seriously. So the key is, it's not so much about Nedarim, it's actually about who we're dealing with over here. The clue lies in yet another distinction between the two versions of the Rambam's Pirush HaMishnayos. About when do we qualify something called Oinas Nedarim. Oinas Nedarim means the period in which a person's Nedarim are binding. So when is Oinas Nedarim? Das heißt, the din by Nedarim as man darf nicht kin godel, na fila mufla samach leish is nidre kaim. What it means is this. We understand obviously that a fully grown adult is liable for their vows. The question is, Oinas Nedarim, when is the earliest onset of the responsibility of vows? It's something which we call mufla samach leish, somebody who's really close to adulthood. Well, when is this? In Pirush HaMishnayos Anofetz Madura Kama state. So if we go to the original, more popular version of Pirush HaMishnayos, there the Rambam says, Boyd can call Shnasir based on the Kebav Gimel Lezochar. You test them throughout their 12th year, in other words, from age 11 to 12 for a girl, and 13th year, in other words, from age 12 to 13 for a boy. And if we can see that they still know what Nedarim are all about, then Nedar of Kayomin, their vows are binding. Even though they are still minors. The Rambam says that is what's called Oinas Nedarim. From 11 for a girl, from 12 for a boy, with the tests that get given. Das heißt, in other words, Oinas Nedarim hebt sich on in dem Jahr far gadlus. In other words, the original version of Pirush HaMishnayos says that the earliest onset of a vow being binding is a year before a person becomes an adult. For a girl from just after her 11th birthday, and for a boy, his 12th birthday. So that's Oinas Nedarim. There's the possibility of their neder being binding. We just have to test that they know what they're talking about. And other Rishonim say the same thing. In the Madura Basra, the Rambam revised that and set a completely different age scale. After the girl turns 12, or the boy turns 13, then you don't have to ask them any further questions about whether they understand the importance of a neder. And their vows are binding. And even though they are still considered minors, how so? That is the period of nedarim. How are they still ketanim if they're after that age? We shall see. Therefore, the Rambam in Madura Basra is saying that the age of onset of Nedarim is 1 year later than what he said in Madura Kama. Even if they don't show physical maturity, which is illustrated by what we call shtei saros, 2 pubic hairs. And we don't even have to test if they're aware of the importance of their neder, and even if they claim they didn't understand the neder, too late. Dos is shitas balachus gdolos. It's brought in balachus gdolos also. Okay, so in Madura Kama, oines nedarim starts from 11 for a girl, 12 for a boy, and they have to be tested to see if they actually know what the neder is. According to the Madura Basra, the oines nedarim starts at age 12 for a girl, 13 for a boy, and you don't even have to check whether they know what they're talking about, and it's regardless of whether they've achieved physical maturity or not. The Rambam says that was the Pirush HaMishnayos. The Rambam says the same thing lehalocha in the Mishnah Torah. A boy from 13 and a girl from 12, even if they exclaim, we don't know who we were making this vow for, in other words, we don't appreciate the value of the vow, different kayomin, the words are binding, and their vows are vows, and even if they don't have physical maturity, that is the scope of the period at which vows are binding. And the din from cotton ben Beishan Chulei im Yodim Shem in Yodim in Kayaman and Al Sifalef Zabazun the din Kinel Kamon Sif Zayin, and the whole concept that a child at an earlier age, if they know what they're talking about, their vows are binding, that's a different concept. It's not oinas nedorim. It's not the typical period of a neder. As ich die Schiene zwischen die zwei Maduras and Asif Gimel ben Gediges in Gemara v'lo yada lahaflois oder v'yada lahaflois, and so therefore we could say the two different versions of the Pirush HaMishnayos, whether we have to test a person only if they didn't know the value of an oath, or even if they did, is telling the that plugs into the two possibilities about when is the period that Nadarim are binding. Now, what does all of that mean? The explanation is this. We earlier thought that the Rambam was somehow suggesting that with vows there's no concept of chazaka. That's not what the Rambam is suggesting. To the contrary, he's suggesting that there is no such concept as a chazaka when it comes to the awareness of a child. Why is that? For him, the Teich von chazaka is, as die Sache stark und verfestigt und so wird es sicher bleiben, because a chazaka means something is strong and firm and constant and reliable. Aber bei a cotton is nicht scheich in chesek in sein seichel. But a child's mind is not reliable. Was eine von den Tchunas von Abba das ist, was bei ihm ist, der Achlot Maskola Sichlis in an Öfen was eine Mishtane. Because maturity is when a person makes an intellectual decision, they stick with it. Aber mezeb muchash as a cotton is a Baal Shinuim, whereas children are fallible. They can, they kind of flip-flop. Nicht scheich sa stark Achlote. They don't make hard and fast decisions, which, by the way, sometimes has advantages, but not for now. It's very easy to dissuade a child from their resolution. That's why if you have a child who is a genius, a child prodigy, cannot be punished for breaking a mitzvah because they don't have the maturity of das. So why is there no chazaka about what the child understands and knows about an eder? Because they're not mature enough to have a consistent mindset. That's what the Rambam says. That's why the Rambam is comfortable to say that, yes, earlier on, when the child had just turned 11 for a girl or 12 for a boy, they seemed to know everything about Nedarim. We've got to test that again and again and again throughout the course of the year. Because that's very logical, nobody debates this, as in them, that you cannot establish a chazaka on the mind of a child. And the chilek zwischen die zwei Gersois in Gemara, v'lo yodel hafles oder v'yodel hafles is, so the difference between the two versions of the Gemara, whether we're testing the child because they didn't know about the neder at the beginning of the year, or despite knowing about the neder at the beginning of the year, is not because we believe there's a debate about whether children are reliable in their perspectives, but rather the Gemara says, I would have thought that I tested them for 30 days and they did not understand the value of an oath, of a vow. So you'd think, leave it at that and don't test them any further. They are not acceptable to take vows. It's like the Shita that would fit with the opinion that Oinas Nedarim starts only from the 12th year and the 13th year. Starts from when they enter, just to be clear, because it gets confusing. They entered their 12th year, entered their 13th year. That's already Oinas Nedarim. Yet, here's the Chiddush, that even though they've entered Oinas Nedarim, there's a big Chiddush to know, if they don't understand what a Neder is, you don't have to test them any further. They're disqualified. And that's a bigger insight. That's actually a bigger insight than telling us, and if they did know, you'd have to test. Obviously, you'd have to test, because they are not yet reliable. Everybody agrees. There's no chazaka for the mind of a child. They have to be adults. They're not yet children. But if you go with the Rambam's conclusion, both in his revised version of the Pirush HaMishnayos and in the Mishnah Torah, which is that Oinas Nedarim starts after Bas Mitzvah and after Bar Mitzvah, there's no logic to say, if we check them before, at the beginning of the year, and they did not understand the value of an oath, that we shouldn't check them again. The Rebbe muss den Rambam annehmen und die Gerse built in the Futz, sagt er, but as we're going to explain, the Rambam clearly has to go with a version in the Gemara, which is, they knew it was Oinas Nedarim, and they understood the value of the Neder, and we still have to check them again. Why would that be? The Asbar in the explanation is this. There are two possible ways to determine what makes a child reliable when they take a Neder. The Geder von Nedarim in Shnasid Beis Ketana, Shnasid Gimel Cotton, the concept of a neder with regards to the 12th year of a girl and the 13th year of a boy, that if during that period they can illustrate that they know who a vow is, whose authority the vow is under, then the vow is binding. Come on, if we could learn this from two perspectives. Either we could say, it's all about age. As by Nedarim darf man nicht warten bis zum Gil von Gadlus. And the surprise is, you don't have to wait till the age of majority. Ben Yud Gimel Shana B'Yamechad Bar Mitzvah, in the case of a boy. The surprise over here is, even when you're younger than that, only just turned 12, it's possible for a neder to be binding. The only thing is, we need to make sure that even though the age allows them to have binding vows, we have to do a test to make sure there's not a problem that they don't appreciate what the vow is. That's why we keep checking them through the course of the year. But Baldadin is asim lo yodu because if they don't understand the power of a vow, their vow is meaningless. And this is a child who, as we've noted, isn't necessarily that clear in their resolutions. We need to keep checking just to make sure the age checks out. But is the mind there? I don't know. Keep asking them. The uftu is in Inyan Adas. An alternative is, this is not an age issue. This is a knowledge issue. And perhaps in order to be responsible to fulfill your vow, maybe you need a minimal understanding of what a vow is. And the fact that you've got to be 12 or 13, That's just an arbitrary indicator of when you probably have that awareness. But because we assume that once a child hits bar bas mitzvah, they probably have enough understanding of what a neder is. Because prior to that, as we've said, children flit back and forth in their minds, and they probably don't really have a meaningful awareness of what a vow is. So, are we saying that this is an age factor and we just need to do a test that their mind is caught up to the age? Or is this a mind factor and the age is just a symptom of when that mind is probably where it needs to be? That will give us a practical difference between which version we take about when is Oinas Nedarim. Does it start from 11 for a girl or 12 for a girl? 12 for a boy or 13 for a boy? So we've just presented two possibilities. Either you're looking at the age and then testing the mind, or you believe that the mind achieves maturity at a certain age. That works if you believe that Oinas Nedarim already starts from 11 for a girl and 12 for a boy. That's as Shlasi Basic Tana Shlasi Gimel Cotton is Oinas Nedarim. And that's what the Torah innovates by saying they're not adult, but they're close enough to an adult to be treated in certain ways like an adult. And by the way, that expression, mufla samach leish, we could debate what is the main message of mufla samach leish. Is it the platform mufla says yadeh lahaflois? Is mufla a play on the words that they have to be able to know lahaflois, which by the way is originating from the pasuk in our parasha, which is ki yafli lindor. That you have to have consciousness to be able to make a neder. So it's the main thing, their consciousness, mufla, samach leish. Or did the platform samach leish, or is the main thing their age? Vaser is in the yod samach leish managadlus, that they're in the year close to adulthood. So there you're going to have that whole debate if you believe that Oinas Nedarim began before they're adults. Mashenkin loy shitas Oinas Nedarim is ben yud gimel shanim v'yamechad. But if you go with the conclusion of the Rambam as he brings the halacha, that actually Oinas Nedarim only starts from bar and bas mitzvah, even if they're not exhibiting physical maturity, is mistaber. Then your logic is going to be as the ganze geht an der Vater mir von Gottes Schnasit basic Tanstrasse gibele Kotten besteht nicht in schon. Then if Oinas Nedarim only starts from 12 or 13, if there's any conversation about an oath, about a vow being binding before bar bas mitzvah, that's not about age. Because Oinas Nedarim only starts from the age of bar mitzvah. And therefore, then the only possibility of why a pre-bar mitzvah or bas mitzvah child could have a binding vow must only be because of what's going on through their mind. So again, if I believe that Oinas Nedarim, that the time frame of Nedarim stretches from age 11 or 12, then I have a debate. Is that because the age brings them some kind of credibility, or do I have to know that their mind is credible? Whereas if I say that Oinas Nedarim only starts for bar bas mitzvah, then obviously earlier than that we're not considering a neder because of age, because the age is bar bas mitzvah. The only consideration would be maturity. Warum? Das ist doch der Technik achillik zwischen die zwei Sugim anal in Oinas Nedarim, because ultimately that is the difference between the two possibilities of when the earliest period for Nedarim is. The Rambam's conclusion, which is Oinas Nedarim from the age of maturity, bara bas mitzvah, despite the lack of physical maturity. Base, or the original version in Madura Kama Pirish HaMishnais, which was Shnasid Basic Tana Shnasid Gimel Cotton V'Yodin Haflois. They're actually younger than that, and they know how to be aware of what a neder is, which is something even the Rambam considers la'alocha. The Chidush HaTorah b'negeh ben Yodimu v'Yamechad v'Abbas Chulei v'Af B'Shalei V'Yishtei Cyrus. If the Rambam's telling us that a child at 12 as a girl or 13 as a boy, their vows are binding, even though they don't have the physical signs of adulthood, is telling us, is beneged shonim, that this is an issue of age. As the gil von Nedarim ha'ipsichon tekefim invert aben yudim shonim v'yem echad. The age of taking binding vows is 13 for a boy, 12 for a girl. Und der Din ist nicht verbunden mit der Da'as, and actually that has nothing to do with awareness. as the Rambam told us clearly, that the Rambam Paskin Canal, as even if afterwards they excuse themselves and say, we didn't understand, we didn't appreciate, we say, unfortunately, that's not binding. Unfortunately, that's not a good argument. Your vow is binding because you're old enough. So there the consideration is age. Then once we know that that's the halacha, that once you turn bar mitzvah, you turn bas mitzvah, you are fully liable for what you say, then we add something else which you didn't expect, which is more surprising. As full shnasid basic tana shasid gimel cotton a whole year earlier. Was in dem is together nicht verbunden mit shonim, where you're no longer saying that their power to make a binding vow is because of age. It's not. They haven't reached the age yet. But there's a surprise. If we can prove that they have the maturity intellectually to understand what a vow is all about, then we're going to say their vow is then binding. Especially when you consider that the Rogatchover says the Rambam's view is that the only time mufla somuch leish has a Torah power behind it is if they're actually bar bas mitzvah. Somuch leish means, but they haven't shown physical maturity. This is mashma fun pashtus hemshach l'shein Rambam, as you could actually read it very simply into what the Rambam says next, which is hoil v'gilu shnei agdonim. As soon as they reach the age of adulthood, nidreim kayomin, their vows are binding. Afal pi shelo heviu simonim, even if they don't have physical signs. This is a Torah concept that a person close to the full maturity of adulthood, full maturity of meaning physical maturity as well, their words are binding. A vow, hektish that they say, etc. Whereas this whole concept of considering a vow binding, if the child knows what they're talking about before bar mitzvah, is the shittas Rambam Chol no midrabanan. The Rambam says that everybody would agree that is only dirabanan. Is doch sicher mistabra as the konas chom is verbunden nicht mit dem etzem gil von shnasid beis for shnasid gimel. Now, if you take the Rogatchover's approach, which is that the Rambam is saying that the year before bar bas mitzvah, if their vows will be binding, it is dirabanan. Obviously, the Rabbanan are not going to say that's because of their age. But rather because of their awareness. And therefore the Chachamim identify that if the child is smart enough to appreciate what a neder is all about, we will then tell them your neder is Kayim. Okay, so now what do we have over here? We've got two possibilities. The Rambam is telling us lahalocha that there's an age. At that age, nedarim happen. Whether you understand it, appreciate it, or not, irrelevant. 12 for a girl, 13 for a boy, a neder is a neder. Over and above that, there's a concept that from a year before, we can test whether a person understands what the neder is all about, and based on that, we'll say the neder is binding. Dirabanan. With that information, we can go back to explore the two potential girsas about what the Gemara said. Do we test a child only if they did not originally at the beginning of the year understand the value of a neder? Or do we even test them when at the beginning of the year they did understand that value? Rabbi says, moving to Chelek zwischen die zwei Gersois in Gemara, let's understand now the difference between these two versions. If we go with the opinion that Oinas Nadarim means from 12 and from the 12th year and from the 13th year, boy or girl, you can understand why there'd be an opinion as that if we checked this child at the beginning of that year, the 12th year, the 13th year, and they did not understand what the neder is all about, I'd say no point in checking any further. Because I'd say they haven't hit the age yet. So, if they've hit the age, they'll say, that means that the Torah said that there's a possibility that from that age they could effect a neder. But if we have, we check them, they don't understand what the neder is all about. Seems that they don't have this ability. So what am I seeing? I'm seeing the Torah said this age is potentially a time where you could make a neder. And then I checked this particular individual, and they didn't know what a neder was about. That tells me that age did not achieve for this child the ability to make a neder. So therefore we're going to say, okay, the Torah created a possibility of a neder being binding already from the age of 11. This child was checked for 30 days, which is considered halachically like the year. Wasn't aware of the value of the neder. End of story. We don't look at this again until they hit proper oinas and darim, subsequent oinas and darim, full adulthood, whatever you want to call it, bas mitzvah. Hevdem is kamash melon the Mishnah, says the Mishnah, that makes a lot of sense, but that's not the halacha. As the ikechid is as der das from Schnasi basic Tana with Gimel Cotton Knufke öfter an Neder und drüber wenn no sie bekommt dem das bemeshach Schnasi base is nidra Neder. No, it's not like you thought. That the whole establishment of your ability to make a neder is age, in which case, if you didn't hit the age first time around, it gets pushed off to the next age milestone. No, says the Mishnah, that's not the case. What allows a child pre-bar bas mitzvah to make a neder is awareness. So if they did not have the awareness early on in the year, well, check them again. It's a big chiddush. Und Vater darf ständig beudig sein, That's what's actually quite surprising to us, that if at the early part of the year, this child did not have the awareness to make a neder, and you'd think, well, then leave it and wait for her to become an adult. Says the Mishnah, guess what? We believe that there's a possibility that later on in the year, the da'as will improve, and da'as is what gives a person the ability to make a binding neder. Keep checking them. Move on. By the way, this kasal kadaitach actually makes a lot of sense. You test them at the beginning of the year. They don't know what they're talking about. We get why you would say, don't test them any further. Just wait until they're bas mitzvah, bar mitzvah. Makes more sense than saying, we tested them at the beginning of the year, and they know what they're talking about. Because who cares if we tested them at the beginning of the year and they knew what they were talking about? We don't trust that a child has a stable mental commitment to something. And therefore, if they checked at the beginning of the year and they knew what they were talking about, we are not yet off the hook. We'll keep checking. I don't need to have an explanation why that would be. So that's the Mishnah looking from the perspective which is, it's a matter of age. And if you miss the age, it gets pushed off. Until the Mishnah comes to tell you, it's not a matter of age. It's a matter of da'as. But the Rambam in his Madura Basra, second version, revised version of Pirush HaMishnayos, and likewise in Halacha Mishnah Torah, as a geder for Shnasid basic Tana Shnasid Gimel Cotton is blows mitzad geder hadas kanal sivav is adraba. There, the Rambam is saying that you hit 13 in the case of a boy, 12 in the case of the girl. That indicates that you have this mental maturity. Sat kenot nicht zu sagen, als war man hat nie gehabt, mit Chilas Hashone darf nicht wieder beutig sein, ist noch zukommen das, wie es darf sein al piteva. So then, it's not logical to say that at the beginning of the year, the child did not have das. Now you should check again to say if maybe they have das, because that is the natural progression. People grow up and they become more mature. Therefore, the Rambam has to take the different girsa, which is, at the beginning of the year, they did have das. And that's the chiddush. That even though at the beginning of the year, this child has exhibited enough da'as to make a neder, which the Rambam says, that's the decisive element. You have awareness. But because this is the das of a child, the Rambam has to show us that in a child's case, having das at one point does not establish a chazaka that they have das at a later point. So in spite of the fact that what determines that we trust you to make a neder and we consider your neder binding is das, in a child's case, das early in the year does not guarantee das later in the year. And now we understand that the Rambam settled on the concept that Oinas Nadarim only begins from Bar Bas Mitzvah, not earlier, even though there's the possibility of making a Neder earlier under the right circumstances, if they show Das, but Oinas Nadarim, the typical period of Nadarim, only starts from Bar Bas Mitzvah, even if they don't have physical maturity. Why is that? What's the Rambam telling us? So once you understand what a neder is, you actually see something incredible happening over here. The meaning for Nedarim is Chidush Nifla. Nedarim are actually wild. The Chidush, the innovation of a neder is incredible. Why? Because it means that a Yid has the capacity to take something which the Torah allows us as a Zolnesa for carbon and say, it's no longer allowed. Because as the Rambam tells us, classical Nedarim are to say, this item is now a carbon, this item is now holy. To the extent that through a neder, I could take something that's an ordinary item and give it the kind of kedusha that makes it forbidden to everybody else, like a carbon. The truth is that this is even more surprising than a carbon itself. Karbonos, even though you're taking an animal and you're making it holy, they're very defined, strict rules. Only certain animals could be a carbon. Only certain kinds of produce could be carbonos. Only certain kinds of minerals, salt, could be a carbon. Whereas when you're talking about Nedarim, no limits. If you know how to word and design your neder, you could even take something which is non-kosher and you could give it the kedusha of a neder, in the sense that nobody else could use it and that it has to be designated in some way for kedusha. Which creates an incredible paradox. When we talk about Nedarim, which obviously needs some kind of a spiritual superpower, more of a superpower than any ordinary mitzvah. And yet the Torah says that a child who actually cannot activate another mitzvah can activate a neder, can take an ordinary item and make it holy. How? As long as they're close to adulthood. What empowers a child in a way that no other mitzvah does? Therefore the Rambam says, Canal, as the Rogatchover pointed out, as diets is that you can only say such a radical concept if the child is technically already an adult, bar bas mitzvah, but not fully adult because they don't have physical maturity. Then you could say they have the superpower to be able to take ordinary things of the world and turn them into nedarim and turn them into something which is now off limits for everybody else because they've got an element of holiness associated with them. Aber nicht sagen, noch aggressiven Chiddush, als die Adele Aflis von Abben Yubei wie Mechad soll kennen Ruftan als Akdusha Bliak Bolis. But it would be one step too far, says the Rambam, to suggest that a child who's not yet Bar Bas Mitzvah, but understands what a neder is, should have that power. Let's understand that even deeper. Afapichein is the day of Kama Rishon and Kama Achreinu Meich Das Rambam. Bottom line is, most authorities, and some authorities even claim that this is the Rambam's view, as a mufla samachli ish, was in the nedem in atera, meint a kolponim meichai ben yud beishana b'yamechad v'yodel aflois, that even a child from the age of 12 who understands a neder, that's considered mufla samachli ish, close to adulthood, and the neder is binding. How so? After we've just illustrated that a neder is such a radical concept that should be off limits unless you are somebody who's bound by Torah mitzvahs, in other words, an adult, how's there a suggestion that it could happen already from a year before bar mitzvah? Wenn es verstehen Leute, der Tzemach Tzedek ist mevard in time of them, was bei Nedarim seine Nitod Yagbolis, v'chzarim farim b'korbanos kenal. To get there, we have to understand the Tzemach Tzedek's explanation about how come a neder is so powerful that it can even do things a carbon cannot do. The Tzemach Tzedek explains the way that an ordinary animal transforms into a holy carbon is because that's what Chochma Elyona, the supernal wisdom, decided, which is very lofty and very powerful. But the Tzemach Tzedek then explains when a person makes a neder, they access a level of kedusha which is even beyond Chochma. Was das ist der Emes in the Shena Kosev, that's why the Pasuk alludes to this by saying, Ish gomer ki yafli lindor. It's an unusual expression. Yafli lindor. Yafli comes from the word pele, something which is surprising. Why would you say it's surprising to make a neder? Says that Tzemach Tzedek, the Torah is alluding to the fact that Nedarim come from a madrega was veton grow from Yafli l'shem pele, that Nedarim draw on an energy that belongs to a reality that is Yafli, that is pele, that is mind blowing. Was hecha from Chochmah the Torah v'seichel, not human mind blowing, that is beyond the seichel of kedusha, the seichel of Torah. And that's not something that we create; that's something that Eibishter allowed us. Und der Kerch of them, so the Greichen Hecha for Chochmas HaTorah is da by Yidin mitzadem was Yisrael Kodma LeTorah. How does a Yid have the capacity to reach something which is beyond even the wisdom of Torah? Because Yidin predate the Torah. Right? Famous Medrash. Who was created first? Both are called Reishis. Torah is Bishvil Yisrael. The Verbund zwischen Yidin mit dem Eibishter is Tifo and Hecha v'Torah. The connection that a Yid has with the Eibishter is greater and deeper than the Torah. That's why Yid, even if the Yid desecrates the Torah, still a Yid. Even a Yid who does not follow Torah, still a Yid. Because the bond between Jew and Hashem is deeper than the bond between Torah and Hashem and between Torah and Jew. This is something which expresses itself in Nedarim. That a person has the capacity through the words that they say to be able to extend Kedusha to something that they chose to make Kedusha, not like Rabbanis where the Eibishter has to define the system. But the reality is, of course, that Nedarim have to be recorded as a mitzvah within the Torah. Because whatever exists in Avodas Hashem has to be revealed through the Torah. Torah is the conduit of bringing Hashem's Ratzon to us. Similar to the concept of Tshuva, was is hecher fun Torah. Tshuva, as we know, is higher than Torah. Like the famous Maimer Chazal, Shalom l'Torah chayt ma'onshay, Amrele Yavi Asham Chulei. That they asked the Torah, what should a person do if they've done an Aveira? Torah could only offer the possibility of a korban. When they asked the Eibush, the Eibush said, do tshuva. In other words, tshuva is beyond Torah. Implying that tshuva is not a facet that the Torah presents us with. It's something that comes directly from the Eibush to us, higher than Torah. And yet, how do we become aware of tshuva? How do we access tshuva? Through Torah, as we'll see in a second. That's why tshuva can fill in the gaps that were missed because a person didn't follow Torah. How can tshuva do it? Because tshuva is higher than Torah. But Torah is the one that tells us what tshuva can do and how powerful tshuva is. Because tshuva and Torah, to the extent that eventually tshuva is recorded as a mitzvah in the Torah. Because that's how things which are completely beyond reality can become accessible to us, is through Torah. That is the deeper secret as to why a neder could be binding for a child who's not yet old enough to have the responsibilities of the rest of the Torah. Because Nedarim speak to the essence of the Jewish person that pre-exists even before they have access to Torah. And that's the big chiddush of the child who's not yet an adult and knows and understands what a neder is, that the neder is binding. This is not because the child has mature intellect. That will happen when they actually hit the bar mitzvah. Das, was bei ihm ist dort der Hafler ist, dass in dem Mann kommt in dem Areinem, die Madrege von Pelle, bin ich schon, schon meine mehr Chochmah bei von Goloi, but rather that as you get to adulthood, this deeper dimension of Neshama sparks and ignites within the person that allows them an access point to the Eibusha, which is beyond even the Chochmah, the wisdom of Torah, and from there comes the capacity to make a neder.